little earlier, Rania, you were able to chat with Khalid Abdalla, who people may remember he played Dodi Fayed in The Crown, the Netflix series about the royal family, I guess specifically about the late Queen Elizabeth the second. Gotta get that right. But nonetheless, also someone himself who's become very outspoken around Gaza. I know he was also speaking recently over the past weekend at the festival that Counterfire and others put on. Very powerful things. So you were able to chat with him about all those things and more, Rania. So I think we want to go to that now.
I am honored to be joined by British Egyptian actor Khalid Abdalla. You've seen him in The Green Zone, The Kite Runner, and the Netflix hit series The Crown. Khalid, thank you so much for joining me on the Freedom Side.
Thank you it's great to be here.
So let's get right into it. You know, you have been very outspoken on Palestine. You've been very active against the genocide in Gaza. And you were recently interrogated by police for your activism. So let's start there. Tell us what happened.
In relation to that in particular, because it's an ongoing legal case, I can't speak too much about it specifically in terms of what happened on the day. However, yes, me and others we were sent formal letters by the police to be interrogated in relation to the protest that took place on January the 18th. But, I mean, broadly speaking, this is part of the wider intimidation that we see of people that stand up for Palestine. And part of, frankly, what I see as my responsibility, not just in relation to what happened there, but also broadly speaking in my, in the territory of my work. I see it as our responsibility to break the kind of negative intimidation cycle and turn it into something positive, where people begin to see that actually standing up creates the kind of dynamics, creates the kind of figures, creates the kind of moment that inspire us, that make us want to participate in the change that we all very clearly see needs to happen. And that's what I'm trying to do, both in relation to, in relation to what happened on that day, but also more broadly speaking, in terms of whatever it is that I've tried to do on red carpets, or the ways in which I've participated in the protest movement. And that's, this is the world we're in, this is the world we need to change, and this is what it takes. And I don't really see myself as more courageous than other people. I found it immensely hard, is the truth. And I think it's important to talk about how hard it is as well. I found it incredibly hard to stand in alignment with my beliefs and be willing to face the consequences and navigate the consequences, because it's not always about this sort of negative facing, it's navigating the consequences. And the real challenge, as I say, is to make that journey, hopefully, an inspiring one.
I think it's a really good point. I mean, you have this big platform, you're in the entertainment industry, and it's an industry where it is very difficult to speak out. I mean, you see the kind of repercussions people face professionally. They get fired from their jobs, they get less work. Can you talk a bit about the consequences people face in the entertainment industry? Because I think it's quite shocking that in the year 2025, we witnessed this year and a half of just this horrific genocide. And popular culture, like, you are such a rare voice in popular culture. It's actually uncommon to see people in these spaces say anything about the most horrific thing we've, I think, ever seen in our lifetimes.
But you know what? I think it's actually increasingly common. I mean, what I have found through standing up is that the circles of solidarity around me are so much wider than I thought they were. And in every single step of the way, and it's also been something where it's also made me think, okay, well, how much further can I go the next time? I think what we've seen is actually an unprecedented number of people stand up. I mean, I do think obviously we need a lot more, and there are a lot of voices that one would hope would have spoken up by now that haven't. And I think it's kind of important on our side of this to keep holding that hand out and say, like, you're still welcome. There is a genocide that we collectively have to stop. And, the intimidation is real. There's no doubt about it. It is not an easy thing to do. But look at the world look at the world around us. Whether it's the genocide or it's this rising authoritarianism. I feel like I spent the basic tenets of my schooling in this country. Like, two of the most important things were the words "never again," rightly so, and to watch out for rising fascism. And here we are. With like enough collective consciousness around us that this is exactly what's happening. And where are we? Right? And where are our figures kind of standing up? I mean, and this is why, like, I keep asking myself, like when, well, put it another way, for me, one of the major questions is how do we turn this change in global consciousness, which I believe has happened and is happening, how do we turn it into an avalanche? Because I believe that what we've done over these last, or what has happened over these last 18 months is that has begun to rise into everyone's awareness. I think a lot more people can see, but a lot of them still don't know what to do or how to do it. A lot of them feel late. Some of them, some feel late, like, well, if I didn't do anything months ago, how can I do something now? And it's like, no, no, no. Now, like, now is a sort of ever unfolding horizon. And I think we have to keep that door open. We have to keep inspiring. We have to keep encouraging. We have to keep being open. Um, it's a long, long, long journey. We're coming up to 77 years since the Nakba.
Yeah.
And
Yeah.
I've lived, my first demonstration was on my father's shoulders, shouting "Free Palestine." It's not the world that I hope to hand over to my children. And we have to recognize the depth of that struggle and begin to also interrogate the reasons for why it's so hard.
I mean, to speak to some of the, well, we can go back to the reasons, but I kind of wanted to ask you on a personal level. You are also, Egyptian as well as British, and you've been very, vocal about justice for Palestine. I'm curious, what first drew you into the Palestinian struggle, and how has your connection to it evolved over the years? Is it just your upbringing? I mean, I know as like a Lebanese person, it was very much a part of my upbringing.
It's lots. I mean, I'm the son, both my grandfather and father were political prisoners on the left in Egypt. But so I've been part of a sense of struggle for social reforms and justice and democratic reforms throughout my life. Uh, but on top of that, I grew up around Palestinians. The Palestinian struggle is what makes me an Arab, as far as I'm concerned. It's a big part of my experience of growing up in the UK. But then, I first went to Palestine in 2000, just before the Second Intifada broke out. I went in 2008, and I went again in 2015. So I've also kind of, so I've also kind of seen the progress of the apartheid, in the collapse of in the collapse of Oslo and otherwise. So my experience of the Palestinian struggle is on the one side embodied, right? I have walked through Hebron. I have been interrogated. I have seen the wall up close and seen its growth, but I also saw A, B, areas A, B, and C just before the walls went up, and I'll never forget being in the service, with the driver who was I had a British passport and he didn't, and I remember us going through a checkpoint, and he just turned to me and he was like, "Every day, Khalid, every day." So And as everyone knows, once you witness that level of apartheid, of injustice, beyond just understanding it, when the circumstances are right for you to stand up, who are you if you don't? You know, who are you to yourself? And alongside that, how do you then create the circumstances in your life that mean that you're not just living this constant cognitive dissonance, which is what I feel I'm living now, you know, between like the world that is around me, which, you know, seems to be treating it all as if it's fine, right? And I have to abide by its terms and try to be successful by its terms. While, you know, every day I'm witnessing this genocide, this slaughter, you know, the child on a rooftop, you know, waving to his mother as he's been blown out the other side. And I'm remembering Muhammad ad-Durra. You know what I mean? Like, but how do I create and how do we, not just I, how do we create a world in which in which our everyday, from the intimate to the kind of grand and collective in our joy, is in service of the world we actually want to live in, rather than the world that has created this nightmare. And I found, and this is like a big thing, I found that by standing up, rather than be like excised and excluded and cancelled or whatever, no, I've been finding my people, and my people have been finding me. And that's the most exciting thing that I didn't know to expect from standing up. And I think many people who have done the same over the last 18 months will say the same. Even those who've had a hard time, you know?
That's so important. I mean, especially when it comes to the idea of like being in community, especially in a moment like this. I also wanted to ask you, as somebody who works in the industry you work in, um, how do you navigate, I guess, having to perform and find roles for yourself in an industry that often portrays Arabs, Palestinians, Muslims, it typecasts people in a really negative light, especially as we see the kinds of consequences of the way that people from the Middle East are depicted in popular culture. It essentially has played a huge role like in dehumanizing Palestinians, Arabs more generally, and making it easier for Western governments to justify foreign policies that destroy these regions of the world.
I mean, that's been the challenge of my career, right? I mean, I graduated from university in the year 2003, right? The year of the beginning of the war. And I was there, you know, my first year at university, or my second year started with 9/11, right? So this is the world that I entered into with the responsibility then, as I started taking on roles, of how do I navigate this? How do I change it? And the answers that I have found have been a number. One is finding spaces in which I can negotiate, right, which are acceptable to me, in which I can still change things because the platform is big and wide enough. And I would consider that part of what I call my kind of like War of Terror trilogy films rather than War on Terror, right? United 93, Green Zone, and the Kite Runner, spaces in which I do believe like there were big shifts that were possible and important things. At the same time, you've also got to work like there's no change that's going to happen without films being made inside our region, right? We can't expect others to be making films about us and then just constantly be in a place where we complain when the representation isn't good enough, right? We've got to be making our own films. But that's what then ends up taking you to the barricades, right? That's why following making films in Egypt and in the Arab world, you end up in a context where you're there in the heart of a revolution and you've got to be on the front line fighting for that change. And then you face the counter-revolution, which pushes you back, right? You learn with time that what you have to do is you end up having to work on all of these fronts and making your own work, which is why I'm also a playwright, which is why I'm also making my own films, which is why I end up again on the barricades in London when there's a genocide in Gaza, right? So there's a kind of there's this mix of clear-sightedness around understanding what's going on, but also constantly finding the opportunities. One of the very basic things that resulted in me when I first went out on the red carpet with the words "ceasefire now" on my hands was the fact that I was playing Dodi. And I never expected when I took on the role Dodi to discover in the heart of a genocide something that I hadn't realized is that he is one of the first characters in the history of film on kind of this side of the world, right? Of the Western Hollywood, whatever side of the world, who is an Arab character, an Arab man who you get to know, not and love, not fear. And so when he dies, you mourn him. And it shocked me to just simply see that. I couldn't, I knew that the representations of this were bad and all of that, but then I was like, who else can I think of who you get to know and love? So when they die, you mourn him. And
Yeah.
and at that point, it was, we were under 10,000 children, you know, who'd been killed. And here we are. Um, So it's a long and complicated battle, but my experience tells me that our allies are far greater than we assume. The numbers are far, far greater. But we have to sort of still have to break into that territory of silence, which I do believe is changing, where people believe they don't have a right to speak, or they're afraid that if they do speak, they won't know how to defend their opinion. And something in that is beginning to shift. And at some level, we have to hold on, we have to hold our nerve and just keep walking the path that we're walking.
Yeah, I think that's all really important, especially in the context of the intimidation factor. I think everything you're saying is something that Israel's supporters, these Western governments, very much recognize, which is why they're they're using the police to come after people in the UK, in the US, to make people feel afraid because they recognize that public opinion is increasingly on the side of those who support justice and are against this genocide in Gaza. And so, to that, I just want to ask you lastly here, Khalid, what do you say to fellow artists who perhaps, they do care about Palestine, but they see what's happening around them, they see the consequences, they see the, growing police state apparatus being used to suppress speech from the UK to the US, and they feel afraid to speak up?
I mean, I say stand up now before you regret that you haven't done so later. I say that I recognize that it's hard and that it's never too late to do so. Um, I say that I don't want I say and I say this not just to them, but I say this to us as well more broadly. I think it's very important that we remove, in as much as we can, shame from this. I think one of the sort of perverse effects of shaming, creating a culture of shame around who has and who hasn't stood up and all of that is it makes it harder then for people to stand up later. Um, and more broadly speaking, uh, I mean, we're seeing the ruins of this authoritarian world that is able to sort of move alongside a genocide, and it just gets closer and closer and closer and closer. So, where is the point at which you, whoever you are, whether you have a platform or whether you don't, right? You do have a platform. I don't give a shit about Instagram or whatever. I care more, right, about your intimate space, about your family relationships, about your friendships. Where is the space in which you begin to find the sort of true alignment that allows you to live more fulfillingly in relation to the people around you? And I do believe that that's a very, the avalanche that I was talking about earlier, it's an essential space in terms of how, if we all do just a little bit more of that, the avalanche, the avalanche comes closer of that change in consciousness. Like the metaphor that I kind of like to use really is what I feel is happening is kind of like it's that coastal shelving, like where like the waves sort of hit underneath the cliff and it just keeps going underneath, and there is this point at which the cliff falls. And we don't know when that's happening, but that seems to me what's kind of happening. And I understand I understand the kind of safety that's in a form of silence, but it needs to break, and it needs to break now.
Well, Khalid Abdalla, British Egyptian actor, I so appreciate you. Thank you so much for joining me.
Thank you for having me.